In this clip, we are going to demonstrate an entire Soviet assault operation, again from soup to nuts. In the example, the Soviet 27th Guards Motor Rifle Division is executing its activation cycle. The Warsaw Pact player declares that his next operation will be an assault operation, and during the commitment step, he indicates that the participating regiments will be the 243rd Guards Motor Rifle Regiment and the 244th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. An assault can be conducted with a single regiment. However, the Warsaw Pact player is allowed to conduct an assault with all of the regiments in the same division, provided that the objective hex is the same. And in this case, the Warsaw Pact player declares that the objective hex will be the NATO units that are blocking his passage here. That ends the commitment step. Play proceeds to the movement step. The Warsaw Pact player must move one regiment at a time. So he begins with the 243rd. He moves this unit 1, 2 to here with its grand total of 3 movement points. Here he reveals to the NATO player that he has 8 steps. The NATO player reveals to the Warsaw Pact player that he has 2 Abrams steps and 2 Bradley steps defending this hex for a cross-attached battalion. The Warsaw Pact player continues to move the remaining units of the 243rd, which are both dummies. That completes the movement of that regiment. He now proceeds to the movement of his 2nd regiment committed to this operation, the 244th. This unit goes 1, 2, 3, and reveals to the NATO player that it contains 7 units. These other units also have a movement allowance of only 3, so they're only going to be able to enter a single heavy woods hex. So this unit moves here, and this unit moves here. Both of these units are dummies, so this doesn't much concern the Soviet player, except that he's making sure that he's keeping everybody within 3 hexes of next turn's lead unit. That concludes the movement step, and play continues to the jamming step. The Soviet player definitely wants to jam. His forward headquarters here has an unused EW asset, so he consults the jamming table, where he sees that the NATO player is going to get a -2 DRM for occupying an improved position, but otherwise no other DRMs. So he rolls the die. He rolls a 2, consulting the jamming table again. He sees that a die roll of 1 or 2 is going to destroy his EW asset. So no DRMs are applied to this because the asset does not survive. So the Soviet player eliminates his EW asset. And this means that the NATO player is going to be able to react and is going to be able to call for artillery. So we get to the reaction step. Now, because the jamming attempt failed, it is theoretically possible for the NATO units in this hex to go 1, 2, 3 and react into this hex. There are no other NATO maneuver units close enough to do that. However, we see that the objective hex already has 4 maneuver steps. And this is one of those few cases where the NATO player cannot voluntarily overstack. So no reaction is possible into this hex because it's already at its maximum stacking limit. So there is no reaction. Play proceeds to the defensive fire call step. The NATO player consults his fire support chart, where he sees that for NATO defensive fire against a Warsaw Pact assault, he is allowed to call in 2 non-rocket artillery units and up to 1 battalion of attack helicopters. The NATO player looks at his available artillery pool. This headquarters is within command range and in the chain of command for this divisional artillery unit, this corps unit, and this corps unit. However, he cannot use this rocket artillery unit because rocket artillery units are specifically barred from participating in fire combats. They can only participate in strikes and counter-battery fire strikes. That leaves these 2 unfired units. His limit of participation in an assault is 2 artillery units. So he makes a fire call to both of these artillery units to participate in the combat. He also consults the ready box on his helicopter track and determines that he has 3 AH-1s that he could bring in. So he makes a fire call to those 3 AH-1s. So the next thing that happens is the NATO defensive helicopter movement step. So the NATO player assembles an attack helicopter unit, brings it onto the map until it gets within 2 hexes of an enemy unit, where it flips to its standoff side. It is now subject to enemy flak. The Warsaw Pact player has 7 steps at a range of 2, which means it has 7/3, which rounds down to 6/3 or 2. So the Warsaw Pact player is going to fire with a flak strength of 2. He rolls the die. He has rolled a 7. 7 plus 2 is 9. 9 is insufficient to require a hit check, so the flak misses. The NATO player could move 1 more hex into this hex. However, at that point, the Warsaw Pact player's flak strength would go up to 7 for the units here, plus some in this case, plus another 2 flak points for the units here, which would now be in range. That's overwhelming amount of flak, so the NATO player halts the movement of this unit in this place. This brings us to the defensive fire step. The NATO player judges that this is far and away the most deadly of the attackers, and therefore these are the units that he wants to destroy. So the NATO player decides to allocate all of his firepower to these units. In the hex, his tanks are an 18, his Bradleys are an 8. 8 and 18 is 26. There are no special modifiers. The attack helicopter is 4 times 3 or 12. 12 and 26 is 38. He then adds another 12 for this artillery unit, so that becomes 50. And then he adds another 6 times 3 for 18 here, so the total fire strength becomes 68. The standard division by 2 reduces 68 to 34. He consults the CRT and rolls the die, receiving a 2, so 34 becomes 32. He has inflicted 32 hits. The defense strength of the BMP unit he has targeted is a 4, plus 1 for attacking out of cover, so it's a 5. This means that the Warsaw Pact player must lose 6 steps to absorb 30 hits, and he can ignore the remaining 2 hits as insufficient to cause another step loss. 1 BMP company survives NATO defensive fire. Play proceeds to the offensive fire call step. The Warsaw Pact player consults his fire support chart, and he determines that for offensive fire support, whilst conducting an assault operation, he is allowed to call in 2 non-rocket artillery units and 1 attack helicopter regiment. The Warsaw Pact player has his 2 divisional artillery units, the DAG here and the rocket artillery unit here, but the rocket artillery unit cannot participate in the fire combat. Fortunately for the Warsaw Pact player, he also has this army artillery unit here. So the forward headquarters makes a call to these 2 artillery units. The Warsaw Pact player consults the ready box of his helicopter track and determines that he has 5 Mi-24 Hind steps that are available to bring on map, so he makes a fire call to those steps. The Warsaw Pact player forms a unit and brings it onto the map until it is within 2 hexes of an enemy unit. So he maneuvers to here and then down to here. The movement is halted whilst NATO gets a shot. NATO has 4 steps at 1/3 of a flak point each. That rounds down to 1 flak point. He rolls a die. He rolls a 6. 6 plus 1 is 7. The anti-aircraft fire table tells him that a 7 misses. The Warsaw Pact player could move 1 more hex here, but then NATO's flak fire would go up to 4. the NATO player would probably score a hit. So the Warsaw Pact player decides to just leave his attack regiment there. So now we execute the fire. There is one surviving BMP step for 5. We have 8 steps here times an attack strength of 3 for 24. So 24 and 5 is 29. The Mi-24 unit has an attack strength of 3 times 5 steps, or 15. That takes us to 44. The DAG adds another 18, which is 54-62. And the artillery unit here adds another 12, so 62 becomes 74. Half of 74 is 37, so the effective fire strength of this attack is 37. The Warsaw Pact rolls a die. He rolls 3. That is a hit modifier of -1. So 37 becomes 36. The NATO player looks at his defense strength, which is, for his strongest unit, a 9, +1 for being in cover for 10, +2 for the improved position, which takes him to 12. He elects to retreat, and that absorbs 12 hits. That leaves another 24 hits to be absorbed. That is just sufficient to kill both of the strongest units in the hex. Now the NATO player must actually execute his retreat, which he does. The Warsaw Pact player then, during the advance step, chooses to advance into the hex, which eliminates the improved position, and then the Warsaw Pact player chooses to advance in with just his BMP unit. He could, in theory, also advance this regiment, which would cause one of these two units to become masked, but he doesn't want to risk this good regiment, and the 244th is probably going to shatter at the end of this turn anyway, so he uses it to advance into the hex. That engages the NATO unit, which means that it is flipped over to its use side. All right, at the completion step, all of these units are flipped to their use side, and we also recognize that all of these units have fired. However, we skipped over one important part here, which is counter-battery fire. So when the Warsaw Pact player fired on the objective hex, NATO has the opportunity to conduct counter-battery fire, and the NATO player decides that he will, and that his target is going to be this army artillery unit. So the NATO player places a fired marker on this unit, determines that his nearest friendly unit is probably going to be this unit here, which has a range of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this headquarters makes a fire call to this rocket artillery unit, using this unit as the spotter. And we now consult the counter-battery acquisition tables. Since this is a U.S. fire call, we look at the U.S. counter-battery table, and we see that at a range of 6 through 10, firing against a towed enemy artillery unit, we need to roll a 5 or better. The NATO player rolls the die. He rolls a 6. So now his rocket artillery unit can execute fire against the target here. And so it fires with an 8. It's only got 1 step, so that becomes a 4. He rolls the die. He rolls a 7. The 4 becomes a 5. The defending unit is a natural 1 +1 for being in cover. So a 5 is sufficient to eliminate both steps in the unit. The counter-battery fire cycle now moves over to the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact determines that his rocket artillery unit does have the range for counter-battery fire, and he decides that he is going to take advantage of this chance to fire back. So the forward headquarters makes a fire call to the Grad unit to execute this fire using this unit that advanced in here as a spotter for the range of 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes. Consulting the counter-battery fire tables, the Warsaw Pact player determines that at a range of 4 through 6 against enemy rocket artillery, he needs to roll a 9 or a 10. The Soviet player rolls the die, and he rolls a 10. Lucky Soviet player. The Grad is a single-step unit. It fires as an 8. Standard division by 2 makes it a 4. The defense of the rocket artillery unit is 1 + 1 for being in cover in the town. And so the Soviet player rolls the die. He rolls a 4, which is a -1. His 4 becomes a 3. 3 is sufficient to take 1 step, which is all the unit has, and the MLRS unit is destroyed. The U.S. player has no other artillery left that hasn't fired to counter battery back, and so that ends the counter battery fire cycle. And then during the completion step, the Mi-24 unit will fly off the map, as will the AH-1 unit. And that completes the operation.